The 1980s gave us some of the best cinematic moments and directors with works that will forever be immortalized. Even specific genres reached a significant peak in this decade, giving us franchises that will get a cult following later. One of the major genres that peaked in this decade was body horror, due to the use of practical effects. It was also around this decade that visual effects were being worked upon, and it led to the variety of CGI-filled moments we saw in the latest movies that somehow didn't have an equally compelling impact. Let's look at some of the best body horror movies from the 80s that featured a wide range of blood, guts, and even exploding heads. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The Thing, 1982. We start the list with John Carpenter's masterpiece horror sci-fi work, which will forever be a lesson in body horror filmmaking for years to come. A group of researchers in Antarctica comes across an alien hunting them down one by one. While they do figure out some aspects of the alien and try to find it, the terrifying thing is that none of them know what it looks like. The scariest fact about the alien is that it can take the shape of its victims, making it a sort of "and then there were none" in one of the most isolated places in the world. The Thing stands out among the crazy collaborations between Kurt Russell and John Carpenter. This 1982 feature exemplifies peak cinema by combining all the best aspects of horror with notable plot developments. The fact that it could not be redone is evident because it ensures the use of some of the best practical effects from the master, Rob Bottin. In a recent remake, which is also a prequel with essentially the same premise, we see all the body horror rendered in CGI, which doesn't work as well as the practical effects. The mere weight in terms of quality and authenticity that practical effects bring has been missing in most modern horror features. When discussing remakes of past films, The Thing stands out as a remake that significantly improves on the original, making it a cinematic experience of its own. At the end of the film, we don't know who The Thing ended up replicating, but we know we would get out of there at the first chance when hearing about a creature like this around us. The Blob, 1988. Coming out 30 years after the original, 1988's The Blob might not be the best remake ever, but there is something inherently cruel about this creature feature. A life form crashes on Earth and unleashes absolute havoc in the small town of Arborville, California, as it expands like a jelly and kills every human that falls on its path. Brian and Meg, played by Kevin Dillon and Meg Penny, try to help the people and save everyone from dying like the other victims of the Blob. It wasn't an alien life form, but a failed biological experiment during the Cold War that somehow evolved and mutated inside a satellite. The film makes some exciting choices, even though the plot is similar to the original movie in 1958. One of the best things is the effects brought in for the sequel, which elevated the fear of the Blob itself and made it the film's highlight. The rest of the characters and their dialogue don't count for anything significant, and you are left interested in where the makers will take the crazy possibilities of this bizarre creature next. Now, generally, you would imagine that people would be killed in various manners here, but there's a certain craziness in the deaths. While some people just die out of being crushed or smashed as the Blob goes over them, there are the ones who are just suffocated to death or melted alive. This film is the second of the remakes we got to see in the 80s, and it is probably the least successful of the other two because it depends too much on the effects and less on the story and good character development. Wait until you hear about the other remake on this list, which is very much in league with The Thing.
They used her image to seduce you, but she was already dead.
Videodrome, 1983. The 80s and the 90s set up the wild world of the works of David Cronenberg, and the 80s, in particular, made it clear that he doesn't go on low efforts. In the same year, the director gave us Videodrome and The Dead Zone, and while one might have caught your eye because of Stephen King's involvement, Videodrome is the craziest experience you will ever have. Starring a young James Woods in the lead, the movie deals with the idea of the influence of television and how it just becomes an extension of one's consciousness. That might sound confusing, but that's the only way to explain a man's gash turning into a tape player. Yeah, you heard it right. One cannot call Videodrome simply a body horror film, as the movie does a lot more than that. It dives deep into the world of body horror and studies it. This film would set up the fact that Cronenberg knows how to make body horror features with a crazy story that has a lot more to tell than one might expect from these features. After watching this film, you might accept that the government is trying to control you with what they put on your screen, which makes you digest everything. The fact that the message is relevant to date and has achieved new levels in modern times makes us wonder if Cronenberg has an idea for a possible sequel or a follow-up to this concept. The Fly, 1986. Another remake and the second Cronenberg film on this list. The Fly is the ideal example of body horror and creature features following the 1981's An American Werewolf in London. If you are looking at this film with the sole intention of seeing some body horror, you might have to wait through the film's first hour. Featuring the charming Jeff Goldblum as a scientist, the movie deals with the invention of teleportation. It is a marvelous invention, but that's not the film's prime attraction, because this is not Josh Trank's Fantastic Four. The chaos ensues when he decides to test it alone, but a fly sneaks into the machine. When the procedure ends, the genes of the scientist and the fly get spliced together, and, slowly, the scientist turns into a fly. The 1958 original film, featuring Vincent Price, also saw the scientist turn into a fly. However, that looked like a typical fly, and the individual details of the body were not focused upon. In David Cronenberg's masterful hands, we see a prolonged transition of Jeff Goldblum's body, with each aspect of a fly's nastiest elements slowly taking over as he turns into the creature. The last half hour might give you nightmares as you witness your beloved Grandmaster from Marvel turn into a horrifying creature you wish you had never encountered. It is incredible that Cronenberg brought gravity to the entire ordeal and pushed for such authentic effects. Cronenberg's vision made us wary of any experiments involving DNA mixing. Just imagine how terrifying a real-life Spider-Man would look through Cronenberg's lens. Hellraiser, 1987. The 80s gave us some of the biggest names in cinema, and some of them even made it to today as the finest directors of all time. Cronenberg is a prime example of that, and since we have already given you a fair idea of his work, we should now talk about his colleague, Clive Barker. Barker was a novelist, and he had just managed to gain an audience around the early 80s when he decided to direct one of his best works into a feature film by himself. No one can deny that Hellraiser gave us one of the most influential characters in body horror history, which will be deeply ingrained into your memory for a long time. Hellraiser is about a man who tries to seek pleasure and ends up opening the wrong door for that. The man uses a puzzle box to unleash hell on himself and pay for his sins, but that's not even the part that will freak you out. Each time the puzzle is solved, something bizarre happens until the Cenobites are summoned. Each of these beings has different designations, and their character designs are freaky enough to creep you out. Pinhead has, just like his name, several pins all over his head, while the others look like severely disfigured human beings. Just take a look at the Chatterer. And then there's the Engineer, who appears, and even though the other beings had some human features, this one was way beyond any explanation but pure nightmare fuel. While all these characters appear later in the movie, the goriest scene has to be when the main villain gets pierced by hundreds of hooks, and then each hook pulls him apart and he appears to have exploded. The later entries to this franchise tried to keep up with the brutality, but they worked more on exploring the Cenobites, which humanized them a lot more, thus making them less scary. If you want a hilarious insight into the Cenobites, you should check out the Rick and Morty episode, Amortican Graffiti. If nothing irks you out, Hellraiser definitely will. Kudos to Clive Barker. Re-Animator, 1985. Apart from being the decade that gave us some of the best cinematic pieces, the 80s also marked the period when the trio of Stuart Gordon, Barbara Crampton, and Jeffrey Combs got together. Together, they delivered some of the most significant entries into the genre of Lovecraftian horror, and 1985's Re-Animator indeed marks a prominent spot on that list. The story follows Combs' character, Herbert West, who manages to create a reanimating agent that brings the dead back to life. But, as you can imagine, things take a turn for the worse. West becomes obsessed with the reagent and starts experimenting with it more and more, slowly putting everyone around him in danger as the beings brought back to life turn into zombies. You wanted body horror, right? There is a scene in this movie where Crampton's character is tied to a table and then sexually abused by a headless body that moves the head all over her. This scene is probably one of the most uncomfortable moments in a movie otherwise filled with gruesome moments that will make you think twice about bringing the dead back to life. Often, it almost feels as if the blood and gore are meant to be hilarious with the over-the-top tone. However, it remains quite weird compared to the body horror masterpieces in cinemas around that time. Even though horror icon Barbara Crampton doesn't get much to do here, we have another movie from the trio on this list that will give her more to work with. Society, 1989. We have all heard the saying, "The rich suck off the poor." Well, 1989's Society is probably the only movie you will ever see that explains that perfectly, with the rich literally sucking the nutrients off the poor. Director Brian Yuzna, who is also involved in making Stuart Gordon's Re-Animator, brought several aspects from the 1985 film to his depiction of the secrets of the upper class, and it works in the most haunting way possible. The story follows Bill Whitney, who has started feeling distance from his family while trying to understand the dark things within his family over the years. As he slowly discovers information regarding the crazy things his family was involved in, he comes across the Society and learns that they are a different species, much more superior to humans. He also finds out that his parents aren't his birth parents, and they are part of the Society, performing a crazy gooey-ooey ritual called the Shunt, which is like a cannibalistic orgy. Yes, things get freaky soon in this movie as we witness all of the Society's beings morph into giant creatures covered in a gooey liquid. There is a certain similarity in how these beings morph and distort, which might remind you of the effects from The Thing, where the alien creature was revealed and exploded out of a human. But the best and creepiest part of the movie is when Bill is hiding from the others in his parents' room, only to discover that they had morphed into one being, with the father's face tearing out of the butt, as he says, "Well, son, I guess you're right. I am a butthead." Yuzna does brilliant work by changing the camera angles and using specific lighting to creep you out as the horror is slowly revealed. Plus, the shunting scenes are the craziest visuals you will get to see, and the credit goes to Yuzna, who was inspired by nightmares he used to have. Apart from the body horror and the often campy villains, the film's largely satirical tone is very well established and puts it in the league of John Carpenter's They Live. From Beyond, 1986. Another Stuart Gordon entry marks the trio's return to the big screen, with Barbara Crampton getting a more significant role this time. Gordon adapted another Lovecraftian piece and brought back most of the people from the Re-Animator team to work on this project, which had a larger scale than the last time. Jeffrey Combs is back playing a troubled scientist whose employer, Dr. Pretorius, creates a machine to make the user see beyond their reality. Again, things go wrong as Pretorius goes on a power hunger after using the machine once. This turns him into a mutated being, becoming utterly unrecognizable by the film's end. Meanwhile, Combs' character, Dr. Crawford, who had been rehabilitated, manages to convince Barbara Crampton's Dr. Catherine to dive deeper into Pretorius's machine. Yeah, that was a bad idea, because once she uses the machine, she gets hooked on it and decides to seek pleasure from it. In a very bizarre yet similar tone, it connects to Hellraiser. But then we see some odd creatures who have managed to use the machine to arrive at this reality, and one of them is a giant worm. In the end, Dr. Catherine manages to survive the ordeal, but is entirely bonkers, and she starts to laugh hysterically. Now, in terms of gore, there are some over-the-top sequences, like the death of Bubba, one of the investigators who went with the duo to investigate what happened to Pretorius. When Pretorius somehow returns by turning on the machine, he brings a swarm of bee-like insects, and they eat Bubba to the bone. But the brain-eating scene steals the show, each going one level beyond the other. Catherine experiences a much bigger enemy when Pretorius, with his fully mutated body, starts sucking her brain by gobbling down on her head. While the creature and the anatomy are not adequately explored here except for the pineal gland growth, we witness some of the scariest body horror that is only possible in a Lovecraft-based work. Scanners, 1981. It is the 80s, so we can be sure that we aren't done with David Cronenberg yet, and we will talk about his cult classic masterpiece, Scanners. While people were trying to bring massive scale to their works of sci-fi, Cronenberg went for a much simpler and more grounded story in the genre. We witness an individual, Cameron Vale, possibly one of the most potent scanners with telepathic and telekinetic abilities. His powers are triggered accidentally one day, which gets him caught by CONSEC agents. CONSEC is a security systems company that focuses on catching these scanners, and they decide to use Vale to infiltrate the scanners' network. Then we witness some crazy battles between the scanners and Michael Ironside, who performs brilliantly as Daryl Revick, a scanner who wants to create his own army of scanners after discovering how these individuals were born with these abilities. The final scene pits Vale against Revick, and they use their abilities against each other, leading to an ending that might be cliched now, but was pretty awesome back then. If you thought Victoria Newman from The Boys knew how to burst people's heads, you should know that Scanners gave us our first head explosion. The scene where Revick brutally kills another scanner at a press conference by bursting his head is probably the most popular head-popping, blood-gushing scene ever in the history of such scenes. You almost wonder if you will get to witness the sequence until the final battle, where we see Revick burn Vale's body to death while Vale manages to transfer his consciousness into Revick. The veins popping out of the bodies as the scanners attack each other is probably the best realization of the veins popping in the Dragon Ball Z animated series. Even though the story had a lot to say, this body horror piece might be reduced to its incredible visual effects and head poppers. Basket Case, 1982. You can't talk about horror films of the 80s without mentioning 1982's classic Basket Case from director Frank Henenlotter. This low-budget production was riddled with numerous mistakes, and yet it eventually spawned 2 sequels, even though the original movie managed to complete the storyline it was working on. The revenge thriller focused on brothers Dwayne and Belial, who were conjoined at birth but were separated at an early age by 3 doctors, which affected them severely. Now Belial, who looks like a tumor, and his brother Dwayne, who is sufficiently normal looking, go around New York, killing the doctors responsible for their separation. While Dwayne sets things up, Belial goes around later and unleashes his wrath upon them, which is quite brutal as it involves ripping these doctors apart or leaving severe lacerations on their faces. In the end, the siblings start fighting against each other, particularly in a scene where Belial manages to lift Dwayne by the crotch, and the fight goes on until they fall off the building through a window. Considering this was a low-budget production, Belial's character still manages to be the creepiest thing you'll see. John Caglione Jr. designed the character, and he did a brilliant job for what can be said as his early work, because he did end up winning an Oscar and would go on to do the makeup for Heath Ledger in 2008's The Dark Knight. While the idea of the basket being Belial's confinement does not make much sense, when you see him unleash his wrath, you realize it's better if he's inside the basket. Belial has a lot of strength for something tiny, considering he rips some doors from their hinges and tears one of his victims apart. We witness some of the most popular, over-the-top body horror sequences in later sequels. The Toxic Avenger, 1984. You might have observed that we are slowly shifting towards movies that didn't manage to catch the eye during their original release, but ended up having a cult following in later years. Well, the next film we will introduce is probably the most prominent example, considering there is no way it could get the popularity it has today. Toxic Avenger is probably one of the biggest successes from the 80s B-grade gore genre movies, as it has spawned a wide variety of sequels and proper franchise with a remake set to come out soon. The movie has a story similar to some of our Marvel or DC characters about a loser, Melvin Ferd III, who gets pushed into toxic waste that converts him into a monstrous being. But then he goes around town doing good work and gains the townsfolk's trust, making him their hero. The cheap movie lends itself to some of the best scenes regarding violent battles, as the Toxic Avenger rips the hand off of one of the goons and stabs one in the eyes with his fingers. One of the most incredible practical effects is when the Toxic Avenger uses gym equipment to crush a person's head with the weights. But apart from all the gory kills, there are times when you are left expecting more, considering there was no limit to what the Toxic Avenger was doing. He took a woman, shoved her into a laundry machine, and then pulled her out to be left for dead. But the final scene, where he pulls out the guts of the villainous mayor, peaks as the people of the town are also grossed out by what they saw before going back to clapping for their hero again. The Stuff, 1985. Larry Cohen had made a name for himself by shifting from the blaxploitation genre to the horror genre, and he always had an idea in his back pocket while he looked for actors. At the time when ambiguous, deadly creature horror films were becoming the big deal. The Stuff ended up being more like a parody of The Thing and The Blob. Unlike the other scenarios, The Stuff was a white substance that started coming out of the ground and turned out to be sweet and quite addictive. Name one movie where people don't stick their noses into things that should be checked first. Someone tastes the substance bubbling out of the ground here, which is outrageous. Other fast food competitors ask for an investigation into The Stuff, and it turns out that the stuff is a sentient organism that eats you up from the inside and turns you into a zombie, reducing them into the shell of a human being. Like RoboCop, Cohen wanted the film filled with advertisements for The Stuff, showing how easy it is to sell something that is a dangerous creature. Now, one scene in this movie proves why practical effects are the best thing that has happened to cinema. Charles W. Hobbs, played by Garrett Morris, is a fast food mogul who decides to make a public statement about the effect the stuff has on people, and it turns out he has consumed some of it himself. We see him showing the effect of the stuff on people as his head starts deforming, and we witness the inside of his mouth filled with burns until the stuff starts popping out of his mouth, and finally he explodes. After watching this body horror comedy, you will think twice before having your next serving of ice cream or yogurt. Brain Damage, 1988. Frank Henenlotter had plans for another cheap horror production with 1988's Brain Damage, starring Rick Hurst as Brian, a literal anagram for the word brain. Now, Brian has a relationship with a leech-like creature called Elmer that eats brains and releases a fluid into his brain that works like a hallucinogenic. In return, Brian has to supply Elmer with individuals whose brains the parasitic leech can devour. That does sound a lot like Venom, but this movie is much uglier and isn't even comparable to Brain Damage. However, the director was trying to establish his private cinematic universe with a person carrying a large wicker basket appearing in the movie, who is supposed to be Dwayne from Basket Case. Funnily enough, the parasite doesn't have a character design similar to the brother from Basket Case, yet its funny accent makes the character the most hilarious thing you will witness in a body horror feature. There is nothing particularly praiseworthy regarding the practical effects of this movie except for the excessive blood used. But just like the other practical effects, the movie ensures that you will check your plate for brains when they serve you spaghetti and meatballs. Street Trash, 1987. Street trash is quite literally street trash, as we follow the world of a couple of bums who have managed to make their living practically hanging around town. But things go awry on a particular day when they are fooled into buying a strange 60-year-old liquor called Terrify Viper from the 1920s. We get to witness some of the bums drink it, giving us some of the most exciting and colorful effects of what acid could possibly do to a human being, apart from melting them into colorful liquids. While most of them die due to the drink, one of the main bums, Bronson, who had been acting like the king of the bums, gets the most fantastic death as his head is blown off, along with some of his torso when an air tank is launched at him. Yes, that's a movie, all right. Now, it might feel at some point that if only the way these characters died was a bit more aesthetically depicted, we could have seen something very close to what Matthew Vaughn does. The body horror extensively depends on the bizarre melting effects created for the characters, with one of them blowing up like a balloon. Instead, the movie did get a fantastic fan following as it tried to make a political statement to insult a wide variety of people, but ultimately became a body horror classic. Tetsuo, the Iron Man, 1989. Shinya Tsukamoto took body horror to new levels with this avant-garde feature that makes you feel more than you can see at times. The movie has moments of absolute crazy gore, and then there are moments you cannot explain for the life of it. It is a story about a metal fetishist who is driven mad by metal growing out of him until one day a businessman runs him over. The businessman hides the body, but the guilt carries on as bits of metal and machinery start growing out of him like a virus. Slowly, his whole body turns into a chunk of various pieces of junk metal as he ends up having a battle with the metal fetishist until the end, where they join together and head out into the world. The fact that the protagonist's skin peels off to reveal metal parts makes it bizarre and unforgettable. Each time you witness one of his organs turning into some metal piece, along with a sex scene where he has intercourse with his partner using a drilling machine for genitalia, it is something that will haunt you until the very end. While the film is already grim in terms of the story and other aspects, the fact that it is black and white and the camera angles are up close and into the faces of the characters makes it even creepier. Marvelous Verdict. If you think there is a pattern or a sequence in these movies, you would be surprised how randomly any of these selections from these features will shock you. Many of the 1980s films served as inspirations for prominent directors in recent years, but they have yet to create something closer to what the 80s served us. One of the major reasons behind that was the lack of resources, which led to the use of practical effects. This added a significant amount of gravity to the scenes, often making them scarier and more horrendous. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and stay safe out there. Thanks, everyone.